Hi there. I am Chris from Airwindows, and we're going to start doing another live stream, as in another coding stream. So let me start setting that stuff up there. I hope I'm feeling well enough to do this. Might be a bit of a tough day. We'll see. Boom, there's a chat. If anybody shows up in the chat, I'll be able to see them. That is good. That's what we want. Been having a fairly interesting morning. I was actually reading about script writing. And there's a podcast I've sometimes listened to called the Script Notes Podcast. Episode 403, I believe, had a bunch of interesting thoughts on stuff like that. Hey, be music. In particular, it was Craig Mazin who was talking about this mostly. And his main point, let me see if I can't... I'm trying to figure out whether I need to reposition this laptop so that I can type in it more easily, which might be a good idea. I just got to move everything around. Craig is the fellow who did the screenplay for the noted Chernobyl series. And he did a bunch of interesting talking about sort of thesis and antithesis. Or specifically, he was talking about theme, which not everybody understands, and how that relates to characterization. He was kind of revising the whole idea of an act structure and making it all about how you deal with theme. And his concept there was that what you wanted to do was start your character out opposite to the theme, which is a novel idea, to be sure. It's also kind of tricky, but it lets you get ideas out of that. He used the Finding Nemo movie as an example a lot. And the theme was, if you love something, let it go. Namely, Nemo, the little kid, and Martin, the father in this story, starts out with every reason to be overprotective, and that's the way he's written. And Pixar being good at doing this stuff. Hey, Martin. Yeah, when I said Martin, I meant not you from Uruguay, but the character that is the father in the movie Finding Nemo. Don't mind me while I try very hard to move my stuff around so that I can handle it a little better. Anywho. The whole idea of the storytelling is that you work towards the theme, which is the point of the story you're making, and you start out with the characters that we're closest to and go through the story with, literally at the opposite of the theme and clinging to it. Like as if it's like bad childhood stuff that they learned as survival mechanisms and they just stuck to that. And that was very interesting to read about. I spent a little time this morning paying attention to that stuff because there are stories that I tell as well, and I'm looking to change sort of the genre of the stories that I do tell. And I've got some ideas around that and a purpose for it. And in order to go about that properly, I kind of have to have the initial... I don't feel confident stumbling into a good inciting incident or a good inciting story. I feel like I got to sort out what I'm trying to do with it and have enough of a grasp of what I'm attempting to accomplish that I can get what I'm trying to do straight out the gate, where it'll be reasonably clear and compelling and all of that. But we're not really talking about stories here. As much as I run into that concept everywhere, like I ran into that concept in Hacker News had an article with some entrepreneurial founders talking about the importance of story. And they're like, this is more important than your technical stuff. And people got very upset with them. Oh, I'll see you later, Bo. And I got involved in that discussion, although neither to be particularly accepted or rejected, more along the lines of, I was saying, yes, and this is sometimes a problem. It can be not good to be all about the story you tell, because then you can kind of just hype things and go from there. Here, let me boost my gain just a little bit. There we go. So, all very interesting. This also relates to some of my changes with making videos. I've been trying to adjust that. For instance, I had to ditch the thing about saying, and if you do things on the internet and are trying to learn how to be like Chris from Airwindows by watching what I do, I will out myself as to the stuff that I go through. I'd had a little piece of script where I was going to say every time, oh, hey, if you want YouTube to promote my videos, well, you know what to do. And it turns out that is fine if I'm in good spirits and have an upbeat tone about it. But as soon as it's like a tough week or I work too hard or something like that, and it starts to sound like a chore, it starts to have an unpleasant overtone and not be a good vibe. It sounds like being kind of contemptuous of like, I'm not even going to tell you to click the bell because you should know it by now. And so I kind of ditched that, and I'm continuing to evolve it. But the relevant part of storytelling as it has to do with that is that most successful storytelling is when you're building off of what you already are. And what I already am is like this nerdily autistic person who's fascinated with sound and building stuff. And I've always done that. I've never advertised. I've always been really disconnected with that kind of stuff. So for me to touch like YouTube channel maximization techniques is kind of off-brand. You know, that's kind of difficult for me to do for several reasons, one of which is I will legitimately forget to do it. But also because if I remember to do it, it doesn't sound like Chris from Airwindows anymore. It sounds like I've been taking notes from some marketing guy or something. So more to be revealed there. But falling back on what's more natural to me is never really going to hurt as far as building a position for the future of being able to do this kind of stuff. Now here's what we're going to start doing today. And it looks like I'm going to need to move my screen around a little bit more. Don't mind me. As always, finding ways to be able to do live streaming and look in the correct directions and so on and so forth, whilst also keeping all the windows up and working. So here we go. It's my development laptop again. I'll note that if I ever end up doing stuff like VCV Rack plugins or whatever, I'm going to have to be on a different development laptop, which I think is going to be possible. I think I'll be able to sort that one out. I believe I have the correct patch cables to make that work. And here's our job for today. ZBAP, or ZBandpass. Because I've just put out ZHighPass. And that was a challenging day because it's not so much about making this sound right. which obviously that's supposed to sound right, and I can probably get it sorted out. The challenge with this was more that I needed to get the weird stuff that this sampler does on distorted high end to be correct before going and doing further plugins, because those are not necessarily going to show off that behavior as much. Like, let me sort of option click here and hide some of these things. I'm going to need to dig out my old notes. This is my notes for where my audio tracks are. And I probably don't need the high passes FLAC, but I need to grab a copy, perhaps from both of these, perhaps just from one, of the band passes, which are, when I originally tracked them, they weren't the first, but they are the first in the audio clip that we have here. Said second order, and this is the fourth order. Now, one thing I noticed from fooling with this is that as I go down to lower frequencies, although this is meltdown, this is the maximum gain. You see it's going up to like -12. And the bright stuff gets very loud. My lowest frequency stuff here, that's actually peaking a little hotter than the other stuff, so I'm going to have to be fooling with the way that the bandpass responds to things. And I'll have to do that without actually manipulating the sort of op-amp emulation in this, because that op-amp is meant to deal with this. It's meant to deal with when the brightness gets real aggressive like that. And I didn't mean to delete that just yet. One thing at a time, I guess. Let's see. Let's copy all this. Duplicate it to a new document. And let's see, I called that high passes, right? So we'll call this part of what I'm doing here for anybody who's tuning in or anybody who is going through these later, because for some reason they find it helpful, is I'm walking people through the sort of basic rudimentary stages of how I do what I do, in the hopes that it'll be more approachable. And people can start doing that in turn, which is it's an interesting thing. It's a weird thing to be doing with your life, because it's like, if what I'm doing here is successful, I don't necessarily make any money. The people who are getting use out of this don't necessarily have a lot of money to throw around, because if they did, they just go to school and learn to do the wrong stuff and wouldn't be any further along. And when people go and start doing something, I often won't hear about it. I think there's been a number of instances. Two of them that come to mind are the fellow who does Whimsical Raps, the module maker, and to, I think, a much lesser extent, Shirley and Spinoza Radio. Those are instances where somebody was out there doing something really cool, and eyes off it to communicate with them and go, oh, hey, I'm a big fan. This is great. Yeah, I love the stuff that you're doing. And, maybe express a thought about it, like, oh, here's this or that, or I wish that this module was available again, or I just really enjoy your radio show. And sometimes I'll hear back from the person going, oh, hey, yeah, I've been a fan of yours for years. And that's a blast. And that's also very, very, very rare. Only seems to happen when I'm actually like sending fan mail to somebody else in turn. And then generally if I do, they'll be like, oh, hey, dude, yeah, I liked what you did. That's wonderful. And it's also terrible, terrible feedback because it's almost never going to happen. So you kind of got to just be brave about things like that. And my hope with doing this sort of thing is I can walk people through this stuff and they will be enthusiastic and get on towards whatever it is that they are doing in such a way that they can start doing something cool in turn. And it might be so cool that I'll find out about it later and I'll be excited about it. And then maybe just every now and then, I will hear back and find out that it's because of, or not directly because of, but somebody saw it as a signpost and was like, oh, hey, Chris is doing this thing. I didn't know that you could do such things. Let's go and do such things. So one of the things that we do is start setting this stuff up from the beginning. And I'm going to scooch this over where it's filling up about the right amount of space on the screen. And we're going to start by copying over everything that we've got in ZBandpass, because this is going to start off with that and then changing it to bandpass, and then doing whatever adjustments are needed in order to dial it in so that the behavior of it works like the hardware does. And some things I won't be able to change, and then some things I will. In particular, I'm not looking to change the output stage because that should actually be consistent among these plugins. It shouldn't be changing. So let's see. Firstly, let's copy this stuff over from here. And we're going to leave all these extra controls on in case I need to tune stuff in. I'll be fiddling with it. I'm not going to have a pulse stretch because my stuff has to run sort of in the moving stream of stuff running as a plugin in a DAW. That said, look up my glitch shifter. I've also been wanting to fool with some ideas of taking the pitch shifting algorithm that I had for pitch delay and building that into a new pitch shifter take that maybe starts experimenting with the way that, like, how shall I put this? There's a couple of things going on with the pitch shifter algorithm I put into pitch delay that could take ideas from the code of glitch shifter without actually using it. And I've got ideas on this. One of them is looking to do a similar thing that glitch shifter does, which is try to switch over to the next stage of loop as quickly as possible if the waveforms are aligned with each other. And the other idea is not necessarily so explicitly part of glitch shifter, but the other idea is that if the cycle of this loop isn't constantly the same frequency, there'll be less of a sort of ring modulator effect, and I'll be able to tighten stuff up. It's not dissimilar to the way that the flutter on tape delay, which probably needs to get incorporated into a new update on 2Tape. The last version of 2Tape is not as current as I would like. So that needs attending probably after I'm done with the Z plugins. But once I've done that, the trick with this new Flutter algorithm that to my ear is working better than any previous Flutter algorithm I've had is it's not actually random. It's not trying to get stuff out of randomness per se. Instead, what it's doing is it's keying off of the input signal's volume, meaning that it does warble and sort of crunkle up in interesting ways if I set it up right. But then if the sound gets quieter, it'll stop warbling quite so much. And there are ways in which this could be an undesirable combination of behaviors. And then there are ways in which, used on a track, it could wind up being exactly what you need. That's something that probably also needs to find its way into the newest version of 2Tape, which we're not doing right now. What we are doing right now is we're going to walk through some of this stuff. And I don't know, I think it's funny that last week I feel like I dove so heavily into this and kind of struggled with it because I knew I was up against it. I wanted to get the high pass done. And I knew certain parts of it needed to be completely set so that they could match for successive things of this line. And I dove so heavily into that zone where I am not really speaking English very well. I've talked about this before, but I didn't really fill in the details, and so I think I lost people a lot. People were tuning out left and right, which is fine because I got my work done anyway, but I feel like sometimes I just come off like an enormous bozo, and the reason is that my communication skills just drop through the floor. And as I've explained before, the reason that happens is because when I'm solving these problems with this, it's not a big left brain thing of like reasoning everything out, explaining it in English words accurately and completely, and going from there. Instead, it becomes a big mess of trying to kind of right-brainedly sense what bit of code or behavior somewhere needs to be something else in order to get to the final result. And I learned this through a book that I'm still sort of in the process of reading a little bit. I haven't actually gotten through it, and I certainly haven't done enough of the examples in it, but drawing on the right side of the brain is very interesting as far as that stuff is concerned. Because one of the important things that you do in that book is draw pictures that have been set up, for instance, upside down, or just violating the abstractions in such a way that you're presented with these indescribable lines. And you're copying the indescribable lines, and then you flip it back over and you discover that you made a wonderful picture. And the reason it was a wonderful picture is because your hand copied the line that was actually there, rather than your brain getting involved and going, I'm drawing a hand. A hand looks like this. I need to draw the hand looking like this. It sounds like a joke, but it's not. It's really something that gets in the way hugely. And by the same token, as long as I'm able to describe what I'm doing, such as this current stage where I'm copying stuff over, this is a fine, safe place for me to be doing this. But as soon as I need to start doing something creative or useful out of this, that kind of has to go by the wayside. I have to ditch my hope of being able to describe this stuff. And even though I'm making a YouTube video and in theory should be reasonably articulate and sort of talking up a blue streak about how stuff is supposed to go, when it comes to actually doing the thing, very frequently I have to go places where the things I'm trying to do don't line up very well with describing them in English language anymore. So I'll say, and I'm going to do that, and then we'll do some more of this. This is a very useful word because this basically stands in for, yeah, this thing that I'm doing here, that, yeah. It almost implicitly spells out that you're not capable of or even interested in describing what something is. So before I do more of this, let me see. I appear to have a working bandpass that is not tuned not tuned to the ZBandpass. This is what I'll be starting with, but I'll be wanting to keep this chunk, or maybe I will. And here is our replacement. This stuff is all the same. What I'm going to do is copy this over and leave the rest, because the rest of this is fine. It's the way it's meant to be. Oh, except for I don't seem to be defining biquad A1 anywhere. That's weird. Well, this wasn't the working... Hey, Slow Brain. Yeah, I'll see if I can keep an eye on chat, and if you have any questions, by all means ask. Like, there's very few of you watching at the moment. There might be more people watching in the future if they're going through these coding videos. I do have a code word in the YouTube machine. A playlist is what they call it. I have a playlist for this stuff. But for now, there's just like, a few of you. So if you have any questions, you're very likely to get answers. Let's see, did I copy that correctly? Looks like I did. And we're going to delete that out for the moment. And this clearly ain't right yet. I'm sure it didn't actually work. But for that reason, maybe this is a fine place to just paste that right in. And I'll worry about whether it's the right one. First, I'll test it and see whether it sounds like it's correct. And if it sounds like it's correct, that's all well and good. If it doesn't sound like it's correct, I'll fool with it. Actually, what am I doing? I might as well patch this in too. This is just placeholder. This is just 20K and get sample rate. And it's fairly likely that it will be the one from ZBandpass. If not, I know what to do to make it be different. We're sort of very slowly walking through this process. There. Now that looks like this. Next, I copy over this stuff. And then I copy everything else over and we'll just build it and run. We'll see where we got. So that's the previous. I've been speeding up things by not using float 64s anymore. That's essentially the same thing as double. It's just some sort of core audio version. I'd love to know why they did that. I don't know why they did that. So let's see, we've got all this. And now we start from overall dry sample and go right to the end where we dither to floating point. And then likewise, we go from here, go right over to where we dither, and we're going to assume that maybe the form of this is the same as it is in the high pass. I don't know if that's true. We might need to be doing boosts and things, but we'll find out. And at this point, maybe right away, maybe with a bit of experimentation. Oh, no, I guess right away it built. So half an hour in and we're off and running. Plunk it into the components folder. We didn't have a real ZBandpass in there, so I'm not worried about it. Hey, photos. Yeah, this is classic C. The classes are basically being used by the template. They're being used by the component model or the VST model. The stuff that I'm doing is very primitive. And there's an important thing about that. Like I was watching some of the folks in the Surge Synthesizer Discord talking about some of that stuff, and one of their key coders, a sort of coordinating coder who helps everybody sort of get their ideas together, Paul, was talking about how he had arranged some of the oscillators to not allocate or free memory inside the reason I skipped the Y series is because I was going to do Y series, and then it seemed as if it was a fine idea to jump just to Z. I can go into Y series later. In particular, if I think of anything that's cool and weird to do, that'd be a good idea. I started releasing plugins for free back when I started in like 2007 or so, before some of you were alive, maybe not. And I was super duper broke and couldn't afford anything, and I was just learning to do this stuff. And there were people out there who were making plugins and selling them for hundreds of dollars. And I had friends, like internet friends, who got all frustrated or were buying these expensive plugins from other people and finding that there were problems with them, or that the tech support that they were being given was terrible. For that reason, it just seemed like a good idea to make, like, my whole angle from the very beginning was to make plugins so that people could have them and see whether I could go by just a general being a good fellow and not getting hung up with this adversarial thing. Because plugins went early to this adversarial place where people were trying to sell plugins for hundreds of dollars with elaborate copy protection schemes that were really hostile, and they also didn't give good technical support, or, it just got to this aggressive, hostile thing. I wanted to see what you could do if you were making plugins, at first selling them for $50 a pop. Actually, at first it was $60. And then at some later time, I dialed it down to $50 a pop, and the whole way they were audio units only, because they didn't know how to program for PCs, VSTs, Linux, anything like that. And they were always very minimal. They came in these little disk image files, just as the raw component files, just the way they are now. You had to know how to install them yourself. Didn't come with an installer, didn't come with any code that you ran. And there was never any copy protection. And there was never any extraneous stuff. So they were tiny, tiny little, like 100K, where other people's plugins could be a couple of megs, most of which is graphics and things. And I just kept running with that. I kept making new stuff. Some of them would sell, some of them wouldn't. But it turned out that I was onto something, because while I was doing something with no protection against software piracy, no protection against any of those things, I was able to get sounds that were good enough that people liked them, and my behavior was also something that people liked. In short, it was not cool to pirate my software. So I never made lots and lots of money, not to the extent that you do if you're sort of holding people hostage and forcing them to deal with you. But it was relatively steady, and it was building goodwill. And that's how I was able to switch over to Patreon. I wouldn't have been able to switch over to Patreon. Well, actually, I'm not sure about that. I don't think I would have been able to switch over to Patreon had I not done that, because I had 10 years or so of functioning as a plugin maker that people liked. So it was kind of like that. Now I say I'm not really sure about that because these days you got Analog Obsession out there with very pretty GUIs and making crap loads of money on Patreon. That guy is making twice, 3 times as much as I do, which is fine because I'm doing fine. But I don't know whether he came out of years of being established doing his thing, or whether he, advertised, because I've never advertised or bugged people. I don't run around trying to grab people and make them pay attention, because it doesn't really suit my personality. And for that reason, it's this limiting factor. But it's also, when people do stick around and pay attention, I'm doing very few things to annoy them. And here's one thing that I can do to annoy you, which is make noises. Repeating noises of a weird, atypical sound effect. Hello, why am I not seeing... Oh, because I'm looking at VST effects. I haven't made the VST of this yet. There is a ZBandpass. So the question is, how close is that to open recent? There we go. This. Now, I'm not necessarily looking to have more subscription than Analog Obsession guy. Half the time, if I get more Patreon, I'm trying to think of what to do to justify it. I'm trying to think of what to do to earn that amount of support, as it were. So I keep tossing around other ideas. The current idea, as far as getting expensive hardware and modeling that, seems good. For instance, I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing right now if I didn't have a machine that does this. So let's try to make that noise with the plugin. First, we crank the input up all the way. It's going to need to be louder in the lows. Yeah, I need to push the low somehow. I need to have some kind of compensation factor in there. Airwindows merch is not impossible. Patreon has tried to do things that would step in that direction. So I believe they have connections with some kind of manufacturing process that would let me do things like make t-shirts or whatever. I haven't been doing that because it's not the most high value thing I could be doing at the moment. But that is not impossible. I don't know if a dynamic EQ and a Soundtech EQ is the same thing. And yeah, as you can see, what I'm doing here is not actually a emulation exactly. It is trying to get the thing to behave the same way, and that's what I got to do now that I start fooling with this. Is I got to get it so that the output of this thing will loosen up the lows a little bit, and only through doing that will I be able to get the low end acting the same. And it's not going to be here because this is part of the outband stage, and I already loosened the lows up. Yeah, as far as the sulk thing is concerned, haven't I just done something like that? One of the recent plugins? Isn't that one of the controls in one of my recent plugins? I kind of think that it is. I'm also thinking about making a variation, which could be another little sort of building block that I can use, much like I've got this in here, this sort of Macadie style gain thing, where I can add additional levels of multiplication here. And I could do it in the form of a power function, or I can do it as raw multiplication. But this is now having 4 stages of input sample being subtracted. And the farther I go with that, the steeper the corner is. But if this was not coming out as the same, like, put it this way. If this is an even number, then it's going to remove the sign of the resulting correction. If it's an odd number, it retains the sign of the resulting correction. If it retains the sign, it's a symmetrical function. As a negative swing, it subtracts a negative number, which is the same as adding. And so the saturation contracts in from both sides. And that's why there's an absolute function there, which adds another level of scaling, but doesn't change the fact that it's a symmetrical function. Thing is, if this is a non-symmetrical function, if it's an even number or if it's an odd number, one of them are fabs, parentheses, the parameter, then I'll have purely second harmonic. One of the sides is going to get compressed, the other side gets expanded. And what that means is that sort of sulk style effect. It's another tool for being able to work with stuff, for instance, things that have transformers in them. Like if I model my API pre, for instance, or if I get a hold of some kind of Neve pre or something like that, and then have a reason to model that. That is what I'll need to do as another tool. And if I was doing something like a emulation of some kind, what I'd be doing is having this asymmetrical clip, which will expand on one side of the waveform, having that be a subtle effect, and then also having the symmetrical clip also there, and both of them happening at once. And that'll combine the amount of saturations on the one side. But on the other side, it will start expanding a little bit, and then it will hit that wall where it is in fact clipping. And you won't get like giant spikes going out one side of the waveform, because that's what you'd get if you didn't have some kind of restriction. Now, what I'm doing right now is not so much that. Instead, what I'm doing is figuring out what I need to do in order to get this to boost more when the frequency is low. And we might actually gain something from doing that inside these biquads. What we're doing right now is we're doing these waveforms, we're doing these biquads, they're stacked up, they're sequential, and we don't have any additional gain. We just have a clip stage each time. But we're not actually gaining it up, because one thing that was happening was when we do start gaining it up, we start getting these really screwy overtones. But to go back to this, and the difference between this and the plugin as it currently stands, that's also going to be something like it's accurate for what the high pass was doing, but it's not necessarily going to be accurate for the low pass, and the bandpass is also demonstrating this behavior. Like this scrunch, where it's about 3 dB or maybe as much as 4 dB more than the mid-range area. We might be getting into what, let's see, the Q could be Butterworth, but I'm wondering whether maybe the Q is actually similar to the high pass in that they used a value of 1. Because when I was fooling with the high pass for the real machine, having a Butterworth Q was not accurate. It needed to be a little more resonant than that. And one of the things about using a Q of 1 is that some of your calculations are going to be easier. You don't have to be doing a multiplication if you're multiplying by 1. You can leave that information alone. Now let's go back over to the X bandpass. And this is super high gain, but you'll notice that when we have this going on, there's a kind of grunginess going on in here, and that's because we're clipping the inside of the filter, but it's the experimental one where I just experimented with distorting the hell out of everything and learned what you got. When you just distorted everything, you got these sort of swoopy noises that are part of the algorithm. And that's what happens when you distort inside the filter. You distort inside the biquad and it does this. So the question becomes, doing this is making quite a loud noise. As you can see, this is now acting a little bit like the real one did. High frequencies, it's not very loud, but we start getting this crazy rumbliness going on when we're going down in frequency. And that's because we're distorting inside the biquad. Now we know that for the real one, distorting inside the biquad was a hard clip because I learned from this. I learned about how they did it, that they were clipping a straight up hard clip inside the algorithm. This is a different algorithm. It's not the same behavior, but there are things about it that are similar. So the next thing to do, I guess, is open up ZBandpass. No reason not to, really. Because that's not, we'll compare what we had. So here's our ZBandpass. This is behaving the same way that the high pass was. We've got the clip inside here, but we're not boosting any further every time we go through a stage. By comparison with this one, and a fair number of things are different here, but the key thing is this is a sine function rather than a just hard clip, although they wind up doing essentially the same thing. And compensation is going to be something that's a little smaller than 1, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. Square root by quad a 0 times. In fact, we could steal some of these things and start just using them. Because here's the deal. I must have made some kind of correction in here. Input sample equals output sample divided by compensation. See, that's got to be somewhere around 1 or less. That can't be a tiny, tiny, tiny amount. Although our input sample times equals clip factor also plays a role here. And that is this. So yeah, it's possible the clip factor is the one that I'm going to want. Let's use that one. I'm not sure compensation is actually useful. I'm not sure why I have both of those things there, other than it worked for this. Here, our sine factor is the same place as the clipping. Let's start by stealing this. And I think I'd best put it in here too. Just every stage. And having done that, let's go and find where we define clip factor. Probably going to change it to double. So there's our op amp stuff. Here is our frequency, which is relevant to what we're trying to do. That'll just make it a little quicker. Hey Naldo, you're quite welcome. And we've just defined biquad A0. Now, hang on a second. What was parameter 3 again? Because I doubt it's necessarily what I'm using. Oh, and it's times 37? Yikes. Yeah, that's very different. A lot of this stuff needs to be dialed in better. Here's my ZBandpass again. So param 3, what was that again? Param 3 is the number of poles. That means it's going to be param 4. So let's just change that. We'll change that and then we'll see whether this even works at all or whether it's just a complete mess. But I do know that clip factor was meant to be a factor of, well, that was an interesting noise out in the street there. Might have been some kind of horn or something. There's kids playing out there. Let's see whether we just blew everything up or not. I might be really far from the desired effect. Nothing to it but to do it. Yeah, this is counterintuitive. I want it to be louder, not quieter. Yep. Right thing, wrong way. Let's call it because, yeah, we're dividing by clip factor, right? No, we're multiplying by clip factor. What would happen if we did just divide by clip factor? What would we get then? One thing about it is it would make it a lot smaller. Well, we have the opposite result that we want, so let's just try it. If it's doing the opposite thing, maybe we just have the polarity wrong. Reverse the polarity of the neutron flow. Instead of multiplying by this, we're dividing by this. 1, 2, 3. And you know what? Let's do it on the op-amp stage as well. Because I know we want it to boost. In fact, maybe let's do it on the op-amp stage and not on this input stage. Give us a little more headroom, because not boosting bass into all of this means that the output level might end up getting a little bit higher. And let's see what we got, because we just changed some things with really no guess as to what it was going to do, other than we wanted the opposite of what we were getting. I have no idea what a Sontic EQ is, bro, so I haven't got a faintest idea. Maybe somebody else in chat does. Now what have we got? Because it was kind of behaving itself, I gotta say. We've got it gets very quiet at high frequency. We're still at a very low level here. I'm liking the thunderousness of it, but we need more gain. Like, our input is incredibly boosted here. This should be blowing everything up incredibly, but it's not. Let's fool with it. Let's also put the correction in literally everywhere. And let's reverse the phase again, because it didn't actually get us where we needed. So we might as well think of it in terms of a multiplying factor. Or should we? What if we didn't? We're kind of starting from scratch here. Like, we've got clip factor up here, but it's not useful. This part is not useful. So this value, unuseful. This value times the number of poles, also not useful. We're dialing it right back to, for instance, this. Funny thing about that, bro, is that there are people who are trying to use my plugins on Ableton Live who are having just as bad CPU problems. And that's because Ableton Live on a Mac M1 processor is running in emulation, and going in and out of emulation multiple times between plugins and the host is apparently terrible. So there's a challenge. So if this is a tiny number, everything gets boosted enormously. And if this is a large number, things get subtracted. So if it is, for instance, 1, exactly 1, then we have no further gain corrections. And I'm going to do that for a moment, just to double check that I have the gains other than this working right. Trying to get back to my original behavior. Needs to get loud here, which it is. And then our low frequencies are supposed to be boosted louder than this, which they're not. So I got to compensate, much like the high pass compensated. That's not what we're doing. Now, how do we go about doing that? By using biquad A0. Biquad A0 is the number that corresponds with how much low frequencies we've got in there. Maybe I can grab my handy little pocket calculator here and go, what is my number going to be if we're starting at 9,500? Well, that's going to depend on sample rate too. That's going to depend on sample rate, which is maybe something of a concern. It is giving me a correct value though. Yeah, getting stuck in thoughts. What are we doing? Well, 1 is correct on the high end, and biquad A0 is going to get smaller as we get lower down. So one way we can rough this in is as follows. Let's use one of our other controls. But rather than multiplying it by that, which will let us go up to that as a maximum value, we'll divide by it, meaning that we will make it larger and larger. So let's call it parameter 5. Now, if this starts out with parameter 5 at 0, that's not going to be helpful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the program and set it, and then return. See, this is the one we're going to use. If it's divided by 1, it's the same. If we start sneaking it down, the number is going to get increasingly huge to the point where it blows up because we're dividing by 0. So there are no safeguards in there, but I have set that to something where I can now scale clip factor the way I want. It starts off being just biquad A array number 0, and that has to do with the frequency of our biquad filter, but now we get to move that around. And the goal is to make it so that when I have it at a high frequency setting, it's slamming the same amount. And that's going to be a value of param5 that's less than 1. We still haven't fooled with, come to think of it, that's a good idea. We still haven't fooled with this. Let's fire this up again. I'm setting some of these fragile settings in such a way that they don't blow up immediately. Here's another one. This can be our Q factor. And if we set the Q factor to literally 0, I think everything dies. So we're just going to not do that. But now we can tell whether it's 1 or whether it's maybe Butterworth, like 707. We'll go back, quit. It'll open up in the previous setting. And now we've got 2 things to play with. And while we're at it, since we did that, probably a good idea to label it. So now we can scale the sub boost that we want, and we can do the Q factor. There's some other things we can do as far as manipulating how much that sub boost scale is doing its thing. But for now, let's play with it. So, yikes. Okay, something went wrong. How about... That's pretty intense. Wow. Sorry for your ears, guys. What happens if we do this? It's going the opposite direction that I expected. Scale sub boost needs to be down here. Up there is making it louder. And it says super sensitive. See how this works? I've got scale sub boost in such a way where it cuts stuff down very effectively when you have the frequency high, and then we get impossibly loud. This is far too efficient at doing its thing. The range at which it's moving is way, way too much. Rest of it is basically working fine. This is doing the correct thing in a sense. Let's reformulate this. So here's what we got. Clip factor, huh? So what clip factor 1 means clip factor 1 means no change. I can still do that. Clip factor getting smaller as the frequency goes down will make it get louder. And the range at which it's being adjusted is enormous. absolutely, completely enormous. So what we need to do is a kind of dry-wet control. We need to start at around 1 and then mess with it like this. Again, using the word this. Sorry about that. Oh, God. I was much healthier when I was younger. So. More parentheses. Give me more parentheses. I just deleted the one I was about to use. Silly me. Here's where this gets a little more interesting. I don't actually want 1, but as you can see, what that now does is as follows. 1 minus 1 minus biquad A0, but that is multiplied by get parameter param5, which means that if I can get it so that it becomes higher value when biquad is tiny and then smaller value when biquad is large, clip factor will get smaller when biquad is tiny, make things louder. But if it's doing that and then I scale the whole thing by parameter 5, I can set parameter 5 to like nearly 0. And if I set it to nearly 0, I don't even have an API EQ. What are you talking about? I have an API preamplifier. It doesn't have an EQ. And you shouldn't assume that passive EQ is colorless. Pultec is really good. I could put together test EQs that are very similar to Pultec's, or indeed get one. It's probably not as expensive as the SB1200. But those are simply capacitors and inductors. If you build capacitors and inductors, you can make an EQ about that. That's not really colorless. Specifically, an inductor has similar characteristics to a transformer. And that might be something that I could do something about. And they're also not like linear phase and stuff. They are pretty strikingly colored EQs in their own kind of ways. It's just that it's colored in a useful way, rather than colored in a damaging to the sound kind of way. First things first. What's the largest biquad A0 that we're going to get? Well, one thing about it is I know it can't possibly ever be more than 0.5. I also know that I can scale everything way, way down by just multiplying more. So now we're a couple of orders of magnitude down because I know that that was a pretty significant effect. Let's make it just 1 order of magnitude down. And then also param5. What that means is let's see what it means. Now, scale should both start with 0. This is what we started with. It's about right as far as the highs are concerned, but it needs to get louder at its lowest, and it's not doing that yet. Now, if we use this, interesting. I've got more room to move this than I thought. Either that or it's not doing what I thought. No, it's doing something, see? A little quieter and a little louder. So basically what I need to do here is adjust it so that it's not giving me that boost. And I think I do need my number out of the 9500 again. Yeah, that would be nice if that was true, bro, but it's not. I wonder what's going to happen at different sample rates here. I'm really wondering what's going to happen at different sample rates here. Because it's kind of useful to be using my biquad number, but I'm not that convinced that... Yeah, because this boost isn't necessarily going to be acting differently for different sample rates. Like if the level of signal is going through the biquad filters and producing consistent results because the biquads are correctly assembled, what that'll mean is that the amount of boost for positions on the control isn't necessarily going to be different for different sample rates. The internals of the biquad need to be different, and they are. But the correction, that correction doesn't necessarily have to be different, but it's probably going to be the same scale. So let's get into this. And by this I mean this. And that will indeed make it be 1. Now, if we have clip factor, we have clip factor 1 minus, 1 minus, and then if you have a full crank, and we are scaling it back by an order of magnitude, if we have full crank, then what we have is 1 minus 0, 1 minus, and this becomes 1 again at full crank. At the smallest amount, it's 1 minus 1 minus 0, and that becomes 0 times 0.1 times parameter 5. Although remember, we are dividing by clip factor, so we can't have that. Things will blow up real good. But they won't. But they won't, because you know why? This section here, I'm going to highlight it. This section gives me my reversed 1 to 0 thing, where it follows the same scale, but it's going from 0 to 1, and it's making it be in reverse. So our clip factor will be staying at 1 at its highest setting. And then the smaller we get it, the lower frequency we go, the more gets subtracted by it, because subtracting by clip factor makes it have more of an effect because it's divide. And this section, see where the parentheses lighting up? The whole thing is being multiplied by 0.1, so the only range I can do here, and I can probably fool with this a little bit, we can make it be a little bit larger, is 0.9 to 1, so nothing's going to blow up. If I had this as 1.0, then I'd be able to dial it back so much that the amount of boost I would have would be incredible. We're not doing that. However, I'll give myself a little more room to move. Because again, 0.5 times get parameter kparam5. Where is my kparam5 at anyway? Maybe I can do that thing of setting it up to be dangerous, but being able to get the actual value out of it. If this is 0, or let's say, remember how it was 0.1? There. That's what I had before. Q factor still is 1. If I save this, it'll remember that. And if I delete this multiplication, I may be able to dial in the exact amount that I want simply off the back of this adjustment thing. And if I've got it, I can build that into the algorithm and have it be all set. So there you have it. We're reading this parameter twice. We're reading the control twice, once to make biquad 0 and once to make the gain trim on it. We're using the same power factor of logarithmic behavior. Console is not an emulation of anything. I just made it up. And then getparam5 tells me how much of this gets involved. And if it is at 0, then there's no change, no gain change at all. And if it is a higher number, then we get more boost in the lows. And let's build it, run it, see if I'm right. If I'm not mistaken, what's going to happen is high frequency settings will stay the way they are. And low frequency settings will get increasingly boosted as we sneak up this number. There's our highs. There's our lows. Slightly boosted highs. And then as we increase this, we're quickly going to get into the thundery zone. This is what I was trying to make happen. Now I do have a problem, which is that in the real one, we got into some thundery stuff here, but in the mid-range it was not doing that. I need to cut this level. This stuff has to be quieter. And I know exactly where that's going to be done and how I'm going to have to do it. So we're doing this full crank stuff. Still need to fool with the poles, but I'm worried about that later. And what's going on here is the frequency control needs to be scaled differently. I think I need less power factor, and I'll tell you why. See how this clip factor is doing this complicated 1 minus this minus that times 5. This scales the whole thing. And if it's a tiny value, it is actually boosting more because of the way that that works. Well, this power factor is making all the settings on this control be more of a tiny value. It's being a tiny value through the middle of the adjustment. I'm going to see what I get out of just the raw control. In theory, what this should do is it will hang on to the attenuation, have it not be as boosted until it gets right down into the bass. And when it gets way down into the bass like that, then it's going to start boosting like crazy. Because this is just the way that this sort of double inversion nonsense goes, is making that be a small number made it get louder, because it was arranged in such a way where small numbers pushed the dividing factor down into a tiny number itself. And if we're not doing the elaborate power factor on this thing, it doesn't become as loud until you get into the lows. And of course, the amount of gain that we have is distorting. And next thing I think is we've got scale sub boost in here. What that's going to do is potentially give us lots of boost if we want. And then maybe not quite so much in the middle. And that's our normal highs. So we'll take that back to what we had before. About there. And we're listening to effectively the, I guess we're going to call that a fourth order bandpass. More or less the same as the fourth order. In any case, we're dialing it in to be like that. So now what we're going to do is experiment with the Q factor a little bit, see which is more accurate. Here's our real bandpasses. Let's check out this fourth order bandpass for realsies. We've got quite an expressive grind there on the top end. That's going to be interesting. I believe I can fine tune it to make it work. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to have to do a fine tune on it, but it looks like I will. So we got about that much for the fourth order. Sampler, yay. Whereas if we go back to this, that's our Q factor of 1. Question is that too much? Let's go back to literally Butterworth. I think we can call that one Butterworth. We don't need it to be a Q factor of 1. It's clearly acceptable as it is. That might be a little too much low frequency boost. That might be a little too little. Let's refer to the real thing again. So if we're hanging around minus 12, boy, that boost is a lot. We're going up to about 2/3 of the way to minus 6. Yeah, it's hanging around minus 12 or so. So we need more boost. Feels like I could do with starting a little higher. Maybe just scaling it differently would work. And we need more boost here. This is not bright enough. Yeah, this whole range is nothing but super lows. The whole thing needs to be scaled a little bit. We'll do that by power factoring it less. And while we're at it, let's move this up in frequency a hair. We'll see whether we can get that working without fooling with the output of the op-amp stage at all. I'd like to not have to change this. I would prefer this to be consistent. And I don't mind fooling with the biquad digital section of this in order to do it. So. Where's that got us? And this is coming a little hotter than the real one. So I should bear that in mind. And I gotta let a little more of these highs through. Maybe I will be able to get what I want out of a neat 1/4. And of course, if we're not distorting it, Feeling like it's kind of in the zone. We're kind of getting it somewhere. Maybe I need to start it higher. Back to the other file. Real thing, do this. It feels like it's wider bandwidth than Butterworth. How about this one? This being the second order. Oh. These are divides and multiplies. What if it's a really primitive processing unit? So I'm trying to use Butterworth, which is 0.7071. What if their calculations are so primitive that they have to use bit shift gain? Is the correct Q factor 0.5? Because remember, we're feeding this an intensely distorted, molted down internal thing. We can hear kind of a lot going on, even in this very suppressed thing, whereas in the fourth order, we're still kind of hearing highs there. I'm not convinced this is even Butterworth. You can hear the hat in there. So let's do our 4-pole. What do we need to do? Here's our 0.5. Maybe. What if we do 0.25? That's maybe a little too much. Hey, finally getting the boost. We're finally getting the hot as we need it. Let's go back to the other one. So this is the real hardware fourth order. Interesting. Funnily enough, it's not all that close, but I think this might be a little too much. Or not? Hello. Now that I've gone back to it, now it sounds right. What? Where's our 0.5 again? ZBandpass is. Oh, this is real interesting. This has got like this hint of the hats in there. Maybe the range of the... How about here? There's this overtone in the highs that are coming through the processing in a different way. Although that might just be exaggerated by the fact that we've got this incredible boost. And that's part of the output stage. Like that's a lot of highs boost. That could be affecting the way that we're hearing the subs in here. It's just letting through some overtones. What if we keep extending it up? And maybe start it a little higher as well. And I'm really a bit concerned about this. I shouldn't have to change this. Like this, I don't. That's around 15K. We'll just nudge it a little. Like the high pass, I had to push it down just because I couldn't stop it from being heinously bright. It was always brighter than the hardware. This time it's darker than the hardware, so I don't know what to tell you. Maybe I don't get to keep it exactly in the same form as the previous one. I wanted to, but reality is going to have to dictate. If I can't make it do what I need, then it becomes a bit of a moot point. Back into the breach. What do we got? Oh, hello, we're crossing over too high. It needs to be here. That's what it needs to be. And I think I have maybe a little, I didn't need to go all the way to 0.25. I'm not sure having mid-range missing is really the thing. It feels like the mid-range is still a little hotter, but that's similar to the previous one. That's similar to Z high pass. the upper mids are just a little hotter than this than the hardware is. But we're making some progress as far as the poles are concerned. This Q factor thing turns out to be significant. And I gotta say, I feel like maybe the shifting stuff is relevant here. Let's open the other one. So, real thing. Man, that's a lot of high frequency boost. And back to this part is louder. Probably. Back out. Let's fool with some of this stuff some more. 16K times 0.93. So that's going to be more like 15 here. And let's see. I think I got to continue fooling with the op amp stuff. I'm not sure that the actual Butterworth is what I even need anymore. Well, let's dial it in. Why fool with this when I can just dial it in? There. And we'll add a little option to this, and we'll run it before loading this up in Param 7 is the op amp queue, and we can set it between whatever it is that we need, and thereby dial in the desired response. And one possible thing we can do is adjust the saturation of the op amp while we're at it, because why not, I guess. I suppose if I go through all of this and I find that everything is much more accurate on the high pass with the new changes, I could do an update in place, although I'd have to be careful about that. Don't really want to. I don't like changing the sounds under people. But bottom line is I have to make it sound correct. And one thing I do know about this is I had to scale back. Oh, I forgot to do a thing. I forgot to do a couple of things. A really important part of how the high pass worked was I had to pad it. Was it that I had to pad it down, or was it that I had to boost it? It was 6 dB off from everything else. I think I had to pad it down to make it the same level as everything else. And that means that this part isn't going to be necessarily the same. Because in the band pass, in the low pass, and in everything else that isn't the high pass, this isn't going to be the same curve. So let's see what we got as far as what it sounds like when we are not having as many of those, that's going to make it a little dirtier. If making it a little dirtier isn't the right direction, I can also make it a little cleaner while still clipping. That might be more, well, let's quickly see. Not fool around with it too much beyond that, but there is a gain level issue, which would not be the same between the op-amp output stage. Like, it's corrected in the audio clips. So I can't assume that the op-amp stage has to be literally the same, because technically it wasn't. I'm hitting it 6 dB differently. Let's see, op-amp Q, you're going to be Butterworth for now. The rest of this stuff stays the same. This is the part that really should be kind of quieter. Now it is. And op-amp Q, anyone? There we go. Now that can get as intense as we want. Too much over here. We need to rescale it again. And that means changing this power factor, changing the proportion. Let it go a little less high. That stuff still seems about right. We're going to get a little closer to what the one in high pass was. Back into the breach, and I want to do a quick little A-B between this and the steeper op-amp distortion curve that I was talking about, because I just softened it a little bit. It's kicking in a little quicker, it's dirtier. Oh, and you know, I've just changed something. For some reason I put Q factor to 1, which we don't actually want. Let's go back to the one that's more consistent. And we got our low frequency stuff down here. It is a little softer sounding. Real thing. I'm not sure that's softer sounding in the same way. I feel like going to a harder clip might get us there. Like that slight crackliness. It's a little too smooth. What we do about that is now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 multiplications by input sample. That's going to keep the polarity the same. If we had 4, which we started off with, that's what the earlier one was, then we'd have it be just a little bit dirtier than what we've got here. And if we had 4, one of them has to be inside a fabs, an absolute value thing, to keep the polarity the same. But what we've got here should be a slightly raspier internals, consistent with the output levels being 6 dB down from what high pass was. It's still going to be clipping, but it's going to be clipping harder and leaving the rest of it cleaner. Let's put it into our components folder and see where we got. And some of this is falling together fairly well. Getting close to turning in for the day, so hopefully we're going to get there. Bright, thundery, and it's kind of hot, but I'm still seeing some energy around the -12. Comparing it to the real thing. There's that brightness. Good and loud. Again, this is the real thing. Now, how far are we from that? Feels kind of lighter. What happens if our Q factor wasn't actually... Oh, that's loud. Let's try that 25. It's 2-bit shifts. Again, this is distorted as hard as it'll go. Here's my available controls. Here's our frequency. Op-amp Q is how loud this is. Q factor is also having an effect on how gritty that is. So I can make it be less grindy by increasing the Q factor of the actual filters. I've been keeping them to exact shift parameters, but I don't have to do that if I can use something else that is more accurate to what the sound's meant to be. And again, here's our poles. It does get bright enough already. So let's torture ourselves with the full brightness of the bandpass as it exists. This is what it's supposed to sound like at full. I can hear a snare in there. We can clean it up like this. It needs to sit around there. Low boosts. That's about as loud as it's supposed to be at its lowest. And about how distorted it's meant to be at its lowest. So, again, if we overboost it, we get that. And we compare that again with real thing here. I don't know if OBS is flickering again. All right. Where are we at? Needs more mid-range. I'm crushing things too much here. And we're a little too hot in the sub-boost still. Okay, so what was I doing? I was changing the scaling again. Which lives up here. And if this becomes 3, then we are not stacking so much in the extreme lows, and we're sitting more in the mid-ranges again, because we're not pushing so much of that controls range down into the deep bass. While we're at it, I think we could also drop it just a hair. I think that's back to what it was before. back into fooling with it. We're getting close to being done with the day. There's not that much more to do here. Oh, but I remember one thing I was going to think about doing, but I'm not sure if I'm correct in doing it. We made this be 5 instances, like a power of 5. And the other one is a power of 4 with one of them in fabs. Thing is, if this is actually 6 dB off from what Z high pass is, then it would be correct to clip it this way rather than the previous way, because it's supposed to be hitting at a different gain level, and it's feeling kind of like it's more correct this way. I'm not absolutely convinced about that. I just have a feeling. Also wonder whether maybe I can lose that. That's a correction that would be happening at the op-amp stage, and that would be post all of these, so it's probably better to have that be here. It's not going to be a big change, but it might be the kind of little change that's exactly what we need. There we go. I remember being able to just barely hear that snare in there. I made this smaller, so let's see if I can sneak it up a little bit. And compared to real one. There's the lows. This is, of course, the 4-pole. Let's see what we can get. That's not that far away from. There's your plugin. It's definitely a little more open, like highs are sneaking through here. Maybe my Q is still a little bit high. What if the poles are less? Oh, hello. That starts sounding exactly like it. Yeah, so with this one, you can go a little steeper with the poles than the real deal kind of does. Okay. This is a plug. This is a filter that comes out of a sampler. Interesting. Compared to let's go back to mine. I made a mistake. I made a mistake earlier. Let's have the same number of clip factors, but instead, you come out of there and you go in on the output. Just what I said wasn't correct before. Because I think that is going to be more accurate to what the real thing was doing. I am speculating on putting in literally after the op amp. That's crazy. No good will come from that. Yeah, one of the reasons the EMU highs seem more saturated and contained is that they are running through an API 3124 plus. So that is, no way, actually no, what am I saying? They're not. No, they're going straight into the Motu when I captured them. But they are going through a full analog output stage, so I'm basically trying to emulate the output stage to some extent. But that's always going to have some challenges in there. And of course, the goal here is not only to exactly clone all of these details as close as I can get, but also to make sure that it has a life and soul to it from not over-processing stuff, which is why I'm doing so much with the ballistics of how everything interacts with everything else. Like if I can get that going reasonably well, and the guts of the plugin sound as big as the recording of the analog, I'll call that a day well spent. Hello. I think we're starting to get in the zone. Back to the real deal. Should be hitting about there. Yeah, I cannot get this area to be restricted at this level. There's this constricted quality to the upper mids from the real thing that I'm just not getting. All right, back into here. Yeah, with mine, this is the quietest region. And up here, it starts getting loud again. Yeah, you shouldn't be using multi-band compressor and mixing unless it's literally part of creating an instrument sound. It doesn't really belong in overall mix. Just narrow it a little further. We're starting to get somewhere. So the preliminary parameter op-amp Q does this. The real device levels are like this. So when it goes bright, it goes insane. So what I need to do is somewhat approximate how just sheerly loud it gets that way, but without actually, like, it has to retain around the same tone behavior. And I'm trying to get it through the balance of just the algorithm and the way that the analog modeling stuff is working. It's definitely a bear. So this is about as steep as it gets. Whereas the real one, the plug-in one, I feel like I still need to scale this differently. Let's do one more little change and I might be done for the day. We're going to go back to the 4 and maybe dial back the maximum extreme just a hair. Trying to remember how the real modulation wheel control reacted. Yeah, it depends. The original console was quite fun to make because the idea was, oh, this works. Okay, there we go. This feels about like what the modulation wheel motion was like. And using it with a little dry wet to just make stuff be bigger. So we go from this to this. Just a little extra growl in there. Oh, no, it's going to have the top 4 controls. I think that'll do. So, I need to get this polished up into VST form so people can have it. Oop. I'm going to call that a day. That's like 2.5 hours of grind. Wasn't that much worse than the original one. It's definitely not a walk in the park. It's a lot of fussing with little details, getting it so that it's acting kind of, sort of the way I was remembering it. Not the easiest thing to do, especially not the easiest thing to do while retaining some of the, like, doing too much math in plugins is a devil's bargain. You wind up making the sound really flat. I think this manages to avoid making the sound really, really flat, although I tried to get it as close to the hardware as I could. I'm most interested in having it be close to the hardware while still being useful in its intended purpose. And yeah, it's going to have the top 4 controls. So on that note, I'm going to politely say goodbye to you folks. You should see this next Sunday. And a week after that, I'll be seeing whether I can do the same thing with the low pass, because the low pass and the band pass, these guys are helpful as far as people doing things in mixes, especially with like your drum and bass or whatever. But yeah, it's all about how it balances these funny overtones and things, like the way that the op-amp Q is slightly higher than it maybe should be, but it's in order to get that insane high frequency fry that the real hardware unit had, and that is part of what makes the highs come through in the bandpass thing when it's set to the middle. It's a combination of the Q factor for the calculations not being as high as you'd think, and then doing it in multiple poles. And then it's also a factor of that op-amp stage being kind of ringy, being kind of bright. So, talk to you folks later. Bye-bye.